Chapter 3 of Clearing Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynette Calkins. Clearing Weather by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 3. The Marsh Road. From that brief blackness into which he had been plunged, Nicholas came drifting up again to hear words spoken which still sounded a very great way off. "It is too dark in this shadowy place to see aught plainly," Etienne Bardot was saying. "Close the window, Michael, and fetch a lantern. I saw one below, hanging from a peg beside the door. We must have light to know what harm has been done." "Have I murdered him? And your own hurt, Etienne? How grievous is that?" questioned a second voice, low-pitched and with an intonation so new to Nicholas's ears that, dazed as he was, he wondered at it dimly. The Frenchman answered quickly, "That is no more than has come to me a score of times. But if this lad is really injured, it is a desperate business indeed." Nicholas opened his eyes presently, and blinked at the ruddy light of the small lantern which had been set upon the floor in a space cleared of hay. The fine dust floating in the air made a halo of tiny rays all about the red flame, at which he stared in dizzy curiosity before he bent his awakening wits to look further. Then finally, lifting his glance, he saw two faces bending over him, that of Etienne Bardot, and another, whiter even than the Frenchman's, and crowned with a shock of hair which, even in that uncertain light, showed a brilliant red. "I thought, as I stole up the ladder and saw you leaning back in the hay with him above you, that he had done you some injury and was about to do more." He of the red head was explaining rather sheepishly to Etienne. "What a fool I have been!" "Tiens, you were as swift with your vengeance as though you were the brave Saint Michael himself," replied the Frenchman. "But see, he is moving. Do not be so downcast, my good friend. I am grateful for your zeal, and I truly believe Monsieur Nicholas Drury has not come to any great harm." Nicholas was indeed sitting up now, forced to hold his swimming head with one hand, but otherwise very little the worse for the sudden onslaught. He grinned cheerily at the red-haired boy whom Etienne now presented as "the lad whom I met upon the wharves of Charleston, as I had but now been telling you. He has amply justified my account of him, that he is a swift striker and a very good friend to me. His only fault is that he is prone to forget he is possessed of the strength of Samson." Michael Slade, the color coming back into his distressed and still abashed countenance, began a stammering apology. His clothes suggested that he was a sailor, yet his manner and speech were certainly not those of a man before the mast. Nicholas could not bear to let him finish, and stood up to show that he was able to keep upon his feet. "There is nothing to be sorry for," he assured his assailant. "Such a bump on the head could harm nobody greatly." Michael explained how in the course of the day he had come twice to the wharf in the ship's boat, where he was to meet Etienne, and had waited long and anxiously for his friend. He had finally heard, from a little brown sailor, about a Frenchman who had fled through the streets from Mr. Darius Corland. "I had to pull back to the vessel finally, feeling troubled, but sure that no real harm had come to you," he told them. "But when it began to grow dark, I was more anxious than ever, and I begged the captain to let me take the dinghy and go ashore to seek you. I landed in the cove above the harbor, north of Branscombe Head, where we had left you in the morning. As I came up the lane, a gust of wind brought me your voice from the window above. I slipped through the hedge, saw where you must have climbed in, and followed. I could hear that you were talking to someone, and as I did not know whether you had fallen into the hands of friends or enemies, I came up the ladder without a sound." And the rest we know, my impetuous champion," Etienne finished for him, since the red-haired boy had hesitated when he reached that point. "A rush, a thunderbolt, the confusion of a moment, and Monsieur Nicholas Drury, of one end of this country, is introduced to Monsieur Michael Slade of the other. An acquaintance begun in such a picturesque manner should continue long and happily." In spite of his lively tone, the last words faltered and grew indistinct, as he was forced to slip down into his former place and lean back against the hay, still smiling, though with a face ghastly pale in the lantern light. "What use to talk more of me when here is one really wounded?" said Nicholas. "I did not know what to do for him, but at least I can fetch some water." He descended the ladder a little shakily, but proving that it was quite true that he had suffered no real injury. At the shed door he filled the gourd dripper from the brimming rain cask and brought it to the loft. Michael was already busy tearing into strips the napkin which Nicholas had wrapped about the loaf and cheese. He washed the ugly gash under Etienne's black hair, laid a wet compress upon it to stop the bleeding, and bound it up with a deftness quite surprising. "It is fortunate that you have such skill in mending heads, since you are so able at breaking them," Etienne observed cheerily, even through the pain of having the wound dressed. Michael's spirits seemed to be rising to their more natural level. "When you live on such a plantation as ours, 60 miles from a town and a doctor, it is necessary that someone should know what to do for a wound or an accident," he said. "My mother used to bandage all the cuts and broken heads, which she said was a woman's business, but since she had no daughter, she was obliged to teach a son to help her. No matter what sort of a combat had been going on in the slave quarters, she was always the one to patch up the wounded, and scold them all the time she was doing it. The big negroes blubbered and groaned and promised they would never, never fall into such quarrels again, yet always did." The Frenchman looked quite easy and comfortable now, reclining in the hay which Nicholas piled, soft and sweet-smelling, all about him. Michael Slade sat down in the more open space in the middle of the floor, nursing the lantern between his knees, lest it set fire to the contents of the loft, and lest also a spark of its light fall through the crack of the window and betray their presence to any one outside. Nicholas, with his back against a beam and his arms about his drawn-up knees, sat in the shadows staring at them both, at the man's deep-set eyes and square chin thrown into stark light and shadow by the lantern, at the other boy's vivid glance, the eager enthusiasm of his face, and at the flaming ruddiness of his hair, all showing in vivid relief against the blackness behind him. Through all their talk, the sound of the rain drummed steadily upon the roof close above their heads. How few words it seemed to take for each to make clear to the others how he came to be there. Michael's story was that he had lost his father some years before, his voice faltered a little as he spoke of him, and had found little happiness in the household dominated by an overbearing brother who had inherited the whole of the estate. During a part of the war, the brothers had both borne arms with the South Carolina troops, Michael in the last years of the struggle, since it was only then that he could muster sufficient age. After the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, the two had attempted to settle down again to a planter's life, but the old differences had reappeared, and since their mother had now died also, the last bond to hold Michael to his home was broken. With a few gold pieces in his pocket, and with no very settled purpose in his mind, he had ridden to Charleston, stabled his horse at a tavern, and gone down to the wharves to see whether or not he could carry out some vague desire for seeing further and more adventurous portions of the world than the pleasant green levels of South Carolina. There he had fallen in with Etienne Bardot, and for a whole year had been glad enough to shape his indefinite purposes to the movements of the wandering Frenchman and of the ship upon which he sailed. It was not difficult to read in the glance which the red-haired boy occasionally cast across the circle of orange light to his comrade in the shadow, what close friendship he had conceived for that French adventurer in the cause of liberty. There was in Etienne Bardot a charm which it would have been difficult for any one of the nature and years of Michael Slade or of Nicholas Drury to resist. Through the outward easy grace of the Frenchman's manner there broke not only the unquenchable gaiety of his being, but also the eagerly throbbing spirit of one whose pressing purpose in life could never let him rest. Of the three, his story must have been by far the most enthralling, but it was the one most scantily told. Where his early life had been spent, whether his surroundings had been one of high or low estate, of these he gave the two boys only the smallest inkling. "I thought, as all youth does, that all good things would come to me for the simple reason that they were my due," he told them. "But I fell to thinking and to reading the books of those men whose voices, in these last years, have been awaking the world. It has been a long error, the belief that might is the greatest force, and that the strongest must, as a matter of course, have the best. Little by little I fell to questioning whether I was really deserving of all the ease and comfort in which I lived. I began to wonder in what way I was so much better than those gaunt, toiling peasants who battled for their lives against starvation in their small fields round about my father's dwelling." He moved himself a little in the hay, and his black eyes, which could be either sparkling or fiery, now softened as men's do when they look upon the past. "I was riding homeward one evening at twilight, planning pleasantly for all the pleasures of the morrow, when I passed an old peasant carrying a great sack of grain. The man had a fine face, intelligent, gentle, worn with the long suffering of anxiety and too great toil. He was old, so old that he tottered under the great burden of the sack, which was doubtless a goodly part of all which his tiny farm had produced that year. It struck me as a strange fancy to wonder why I should be riding so easily upon a fine horse, and he, who had wrought and toiled and made something in the world where I had made nothing, should be trudging along that rough road before me. As I came up with him, I slipped out of the saddle on some impulse which I did not myself understand, and said, 'Friend, let me carry that burden for you.' The look that came upon his face is one which will burn my heart to the end of my days. It showed distrust, bewilderment, then abject fear, all born of 1,000 years of injustice and abuse. He gave a hoarse cry of terror, and, leaving the sack in my hands, fled away through the hedge and disappeared into the twilight. He thought I was mad, or that I meant to rob him of that little which grinding rents, taxes, and the endless demands of his overlords had allowed him to keep. I sought to follow, but he only fled the more swiftly, leaving me holding all of his worldly goods, and feeling myself to be the useless, wicked blunderer which I so truly was." The two boys were listening with silent intentness, waiting for the end of the tale. Michael told Nicholas long after that this was as near as Etienne, in all the year of their acquaintance, had ever come to speaking definitely of his past. But the Frenchman had closed the door upon reminiscence, and the rest of the story told them but little. "Not all at once, but slowly from that hour, I began to see the truth, that the times of greed and oppression were coming to an end. The spirit of liberty is running like sparks through stubble, and is flaring up, now here, now there. It cannot be quenched, even in its smallest flame, for it is part of the great fire which with a rising wind will presently sweep across the world." As he moved forward in the hay, the fire of which he spoke seemed to be shining in his face. "I have gone hither and yonder, doing what seemed to me possible to stir men's hearts, to make the oppressors see their wrong, to make the oppressed less fiercely cruel in their intent to win their rights. I have known prison and escape. I have come in contact with the secret arms of the law. I know where spies and traitors abide, and who it is who is dwelling in one country and doing the service and pocketing the gold of another. It is thus that I have come upon the unbeautiful record of our friend Monsieur Darius Courland, and of his share in your war just past." At that name Nicholas felt the leap of a memory many years old. The tossing glare of torches, the shipyard full of battling men, the crash of cannon, and that dark face standing tall above him, illumined by the fierce anger which burned within, rather than by the red light streaming up from the battle and destruction below. He did not interrupt, however, and Etienne continued. "He did his best to keep your struggle for liberty from coming to a victorious end, and his efforts are not yet concluded. He has instruction from his masters in England to do what he can to forward the discord and distress among the colonies, and give them in London all news of it. He has orders also, I begin to believe, to lay hands by any pretext upon the person of one Etienne Bardot, the friend of revolutions. And since he knows that I understand whence these commands come, he fears me as much as he hates me, and at this moment, seated comfortably beside his fire under the safe roof of the Blackbird Inn, he is shaking a little in his stout, shining, silver-buckled shoes." There was a silence, Nicholas thinking over what he had said, the others seeming to be waiting. At last the Frenchman said quietly, "You have heard much of us both, Monsieur Drury, for we too have felt that we could trust you with all of our knowledge. Now may we not hear something of you, and how you came, for instance, to be drawing pictures of ships between midnight and morning?" Nicholas looked up quickly to cast a startled glance at his new friend. Yet before he could speak, a sound below silenced them all. In the intentness of their talk, they had not noticed that the pattering rain overhead had almost ceased. The wind had risen, and was bringing them, in intermittent snatches of sound, the splashing of feet in the wet and narrow lane, together with two voices growing plainly audible as they approached. Michael leaned forward quickly and blew out the light. All three of them sat utterly still to listen. "There is nothing to be seen now." Nicholas recognized the harsh twang of Joseph Ryle. "Yet I could swear I caught sight of a spark of light behind that upper window. And see," he stopped almost below them, "there is a gap in the hedge, and an open shutter of the shed where someone could have climbed in." "Then in with you, after him." This was the heavier voice of Darius Courland. "It is still my belief that the man is hiding, like a water-soaked rat, down yonder in the marsh, but it were safer to look once more." Can we not go in together?" stammered Joseph Ryle. "No, that space is too narrow and too high for me." The listeners overhead heard a scuffling as Ryle climbed up and came clumsily to the ground inside the shed. A long minute of hesitation followed. "The villain's friends may have found him, and there could be half a score of murderers hid in this blackness," he quavered. "Go on, you fool!" stormed the man outside. "If I had not sent Tom Travers on another errand, we would know in a minute what was within." Joseph Ryle commenced a stumbling progress in the dark, which came to an abrupt end in a great rustling and stamping, in the snort of an indignant horse, and in a loud-pitched cry of pain. Plump Dobbin, an elderly steed of precise habits, had mistaken the early darkness of that stormy evening for midnight, and had retired to his rest. He now came scrambling to his feet, lunging out in the blackness, whether by accident or with angry purpose, and coming into violent contact with some portion of Joseph Ryle's bony person. "The evil brute has kicked me on the knee, so that I doubt not I am lamed for life," wailed the lawyer. "Go on," ordered the unrelenting Mr. Corland. "There should be a ladder somewhere, leading up to the loft." Under cover of the disturbance raised by Dobbin, Nicholas and Michael had crept to the head of the ladder. Without a sound, Michael had freed his cutlass from its sheath and stood with it ready in his hand. "Give me a little space," the red-haired boy breathed close to Nicholas's ear. "I will pin him against the wall the moment he reaches the last rung." A sudden shaking of the ladder at their feet told them that the man beneath had blundered against it in the dark. For what seemed an endless time they waited, the three above and the one below. "There is nothing here," the voice beneath finally pronounced shakily. "I have felt to and fro, and the whole space is clear. If there ever was a ladder, someone has carried it away." The fuming answer of Darius drifted up to them. "Well, since you are so fearful of the dark and a fat gray horse 100 years old, come out and we will go farther upon our way." With surprising ease and speed, the injured man scrambled through the window and spoke in delightful relief outside. "As you said, the fellow must be in the marsh, and his ship probably stealing in to pick him up. We may see her lights from the marsh road. I will await you here while you walk down to look." "You will come with me," growled Darius. In spite of vehement protest, the lawyer seemed to feel himself forced to obey. Their voices, apparently speaking in little harmony, grew inaudible in the distance. Moving cautiously still, Nicholas and Michael stole back to their places, where they sat down in complete darkness now. Etienne Bardot, speaking somewhat low, returned to his question. It was as though experience had taught him that no time was to be lost in furthering his knowledge of a friend. "I repeat that what we know of you, Monsieur Drury, is very little. What I heard in the village concerning you and your uncle and the shipyards which you own was not enough. Adversity makes quick and sudden friendships, even as it also makes sudden partings. May we all not understand each other once before we scatter again across the world?" Nicholas drew a great breath. Shyness held him back, but the darkness and the easy friendliness of the strangers tempted him forward. He began very lamely. "What is there more to tell beyond what you have heard?" Then, with an outburst of frankness born of all that the other two had told him, he went on. "It is all, except that things are worse for my uncle and for me than anyone in the town could have told you. The chances of war, and still more these difficult times following the war, have ruined many things, and amongst them the shipbuilding of Branscombe. It has been one thing and then another, and now there is nothing more. The Drury ships will never put to sea again." His words were growing uncertain, and he fell into abrupt silence. Etienne Bardot stirred in the hay as though he were leaning forward to peer at him through the dark. "You take the misfortune very heavily, my young monsieur. Disappointment in such early years as yours should not be so terrible a disaster. Is the matter of money earned or lost a thing to break one's heart?" "It is not the money." Nicholas was glad that there was no light by which the others could see the pain upon his face. "It is the ships which my uncle and I were to build together. I must build ships. There is no other thing which I can hope to do even passably well. But no one wants them now. And the plans we had, the great things which we were to do." He spoke very slowly, lest his voice betray him. "They are all gone." "I see." The Frenchman spoke very gravely. "That is indeed no easy thing to bear with courage. Even aside from what it means to you, this matter of the ships is a pity, 1,000 pities. It is by ships that your country, and in especial this region of New England, can win to prosperity again. It is by ships that America will send to all the world her message that a free government of the people can rise to strength and power. At this moment, just such hopes for the future cannot be bright here in your United States." "They are not," agreed Michael. "Our Congress is weak, and the colonies are quarreling among themselves. There are no laws. There is no money save in the hands of a few private persons here and there. It is no wonder that men are coming to ruin, both in this place and elsewhere. But what is to be done?" "What is to be done?" repeated Etienne. "Here in the grasp of New England there is one task very plain, the greatest service which she can offer to her country. It is to get her ships to sea." "But how?" asked Nicholas desperately. "In the face of mortal necessity, there is always a way to do even the impossible," maintained the Frenchman. "By brave striving you have earned the right to have your freedom. Now you must earn the right to keep it. By plying your hammers, by hoisting your sails, so will you gather wealth and honor before the world. Here is wondrous opportunity. Yet because at the moment money and faith are lacking, because in this place the danger of ruin seems to have crept very close, for these things it appears that you can do nothing." His voice had risen to reckless, ringing emphasis, but now he let it drop suddenly. There were other matters of which he must speak, and now, in spite of certain evidence of weakness and pain, he continued. There was a businesslike dryness in his tone, as though he were taking up, perforce, a task which must be performed while there was still time. "We must return after a long round to Darius Corland. It was to gain certain information concerning him that I have come to Branscombe. Do you have any recollection, Monsieur Drury, of a certain night in October of the year 1775, in the first season of the war?" Nicholas had no need to ponder his answer. Everyone in the town still talked of that blood-stained, fire-reddened evening, the night that the British burned and scuttled the Drury ships. Under questioning from Etienne, he gave brief account of that affair, but did not take the time to describe just how he had watched it. "A great many have wondered," he concluded, "by just what chance it was that the English ships came on the night when our defenders were all at a distance. Questions long unanswered sometimes come at last to their reply," Etienne Bardot said. "And I, too, have had in my mind for many months a query of my own. Why should a certain man of your town have lately written a letter to the British authorities complaining, 'You have not rewarded me for the service I did you on that night of October in the first year of the American War. Now that the affair is ended, I look to have my just due?'" "Who wrote thus?" exclaimed Nicholas. Yet suspicion, casting backward, stopped dead at the recollection of Darius Corland watching the British raid with the red firelight on his face. You have no need to tell me," he ended. The Frenchman reached within his coat and drew forth a letter, folded very small and without the usual conspicuous red wafers and big seals. "This is our friend Darius's little message, written some months ago to his colleagues in England concerning that same engagement of which you have just told us. He reports further the present discord between the colonies, and speaks his pleasant hope that they will fail to form a government, and will presently fall into war amongst themselves. But the burden of his missive is reproach that he has received such small recompense for his great services during the past war, and yet this brave Darius drew sword on neither side." "But how could the letter have come to you?" Nicholas insisted. "Monsieur Courland is a crafty soul, but not always a good judge of men. He gave his dangerous epistle into the hands of one whom he thought to be a trusty messenger, but he was abusive in his orders, and grudging in the price which this owner demands for its services. The man having, I grieve to say, no delicacy, first opened the letter and read it, as no true gentleman should have done. Then, falling in with me, and thinking that I had done him some small service, and that this would be a return, he gave the paper into my hands, and I have heard that, later, in sheer bravado, he even dropped hints to Darius of whither his letter had gone. It was not kind, and also it was not wise, but I, not caring much to be concerned in these affairs of Monsieur Courland's, thought, when I next came to these coasts, I could return the paper to him, thus giving him a little fright and a wholesome lesson." "You came to Branscombe for that?" Michael Slade asked, evidently having heard nothing of this matter before. "I came for that, but thought that I would first make some small inquiry as to just what was this occasion of October in the first year of the war. By very brief talk in the marketplace, I began to have an inkling of what that affair was, and gave up my intention of giving back the document to a man who had betrayed his neighbors. But just as I was learning a multitude of interesting facts from a loquacious fellow townsman of yours, Monsieur Drury, one Gaffer Hindle, there was a rolling of wheels over the cobbles, and the very man whom I had come to see cried out to the people to lay hands upon me. It was his clumsy way of getting his letter once more into his possession." "But in a free country he could not have done you real harm," Michael exclaimed. "Not by fair means, but he could have found methods less than fair," the Frenchman replied. "He has no cause to wish me good fortune." He turned over the letter in his hand, smiling a little to himself as he regarded it. Then, as though on sudden impulse, he held it out to Nicholas. "I give it to you," he declared. "A talisman against the evil eye of Darius Courland. It has been told me that the man has been pressing you and your uncle very hard. If ever he should seem to be gaining mastery of the situation, you have there a magic charm which should break his power." With some hesitation, Nicholas took the letter and looked at it doubtfully, but upon the other's insisting, "I beg of you do as I direct," he put it slowly away inside his own coat. "I do not like having it," he still protested, but Etienne persisted none the less. "It may do good in your hands. It can do none in any other place. Keep it safe from him, for he does not deserve to recover it." It seemed useless to decline further, Nicholas, moreover, was eager to go on to a certain question which had grown continually greater within him, since the coming of Darius Corland and Joseph Ryle had interrupted its asking. It had sprung to his lips at the Frenchman's words, "How came you thus to be drawing a ship between midnight and morning?" "Where?" the boy asked bluntly. "Where was it that you came ashore to seek information of Mr. Corland? Did you land at the wharf where the other boats come in, or... He did not go on, and he somehow felt that in the dark the Frenchman had flashed him again that quick, unreadable smile. "I landed in the cove north of Branscombe Head, at the foot of an unused road which led up past a marsh. I had been told that was the nearest way to a certain inn where Darius Corland often lodged, and where he, or news of him, might be most quickly found." "And you came before morning?" persisted Nicholas. "It was only faintly beginning to be day when I walked up through a garden white with frost, under old plum trees wreathed with silver, and I was struck by the fact that, at one of the lower windows of the house, a candle was burning with the dawn already at hand. I came close. I even pressed my face against the pane, and saw, instead of Darius Corland, as I had half expected, a younger person, sitting at a table covered with papers, someone who looked weary and haggard from long night watching, yet who at that moment was most happily busy in the making of a ship." What a fool you must have thought me!" observed Nicholas, reddening as he had done when Caleb Harmon had referred to that same occupation. "I thought," answered the Frenchman gravely, "that here, where New England's future looked the darkest, was hope at last. For in this troubled hour it is in ships, and the prosperity which they will bring, that her hope and the great hope of this country must lie." "I thought, long afterward, that I had heard somebody at the window," Nicholas said. "I pondered whether I should speak to you or not. I even raised my hand to tap upon the glass. But in the end I thought your work was such as ought not to be meddled with. I stole away and turned my steps toward the village with the idea, I will own, of finding out something of who you were from the talk of your friends. Yet it seemed to me that I already knew you, so much had I read upon your face as you sat drawing your ship and seeing a remote vision of whither she was to sail." It was not possible for any of them to speak further, for Nicholas had made a warning movement. He had heard Darius Corland and his companion coming back from their expedition to the foot of the lane where it touched the edge of the marsh. Michael, moving without sound, pushed partly open the shutter of the window so that they might hearken the better. "Do you think they went all the way down to the cove?" he questioned of Nicholas in an almost noiseless whisper. "Perhaps they found my boat, though I tried to moor it out of sight below a jutting boulder." "I do not think they went so far as that," Nicholas replied in a tone equally cautious. "They would never make their way through the ruts and water of the marsh road." The wind had risen to even greater strength, and was buffeting and jostling them as it roared behind them from off the sea. Involuntarily they walked slower as they passed for a moment in the shelter of the shed. They were talking now of public affairs, and Joseph Ryle was giving voice to such Tory opinions as filled Nicholas with astonishment, since all through the war that astute lawyer had been one of the loudest to raise the cry for liberty. Darius Corland was merely making more plain that attitude of which they now had such full knowledge. "When will this game of fools end, this pretense of America's that she can make a government of her own?" Joseph Ryle was saying. "Before long, you may depend upon it. The colonies will never stand together." Mr. Cornelian replied, "One by one they will drop away and come whining back to England to be made her own again." "You are right, sir," returned the lawyer, his thin voice less audible than the others. It was Mr. Cornelian who went on. "The men who have been calling themselves patriots will find out that they have a harder task now than merely to cry out 'Tyrant!' and discharge guns. They have liked the war but little. They will find that they like peace and independence even less. Let them go on. Let them quarrel to their heart's content amongst themselves. We will soon hear no more of those high-sounding principles of which they have been prating. They have neither the spirit nor the heart to defend that liberty to which, with the empty flourish of lying fools, they once pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor." What scorn there was in his voice as he stood still for a moment to drop those last words just below the window. Nicholas could scarcely forbear crying out in his anger, and he felt Michael quiver as he listened. The next few sentences were lost by a sudden gust in the windy blackness, but as the two went on, the voice of Joseph Ryle came up in unconscious corroboration of the words of Etienne Bardot. "It is the lack of prosperity which will be the country's undoing. Every shipyard in New England which closes makes a long stride toward the end for which we hope." It was as though the scathing words of Darius Cornelian had cast a spell over those two listening above him. Neither boy moved or spoke until long after the slamming of the garden door told them that the men were within the inn once more. When Nicholas stirred at last, the pair looked at each other steadily through the gloom, but neither commented on what they had heard. "How far out does your ship lie?" Nicholas asked. "Off the island on the north side of the head," Michael answered. "It is a good enough anchorage even with this rising wind." "Did you come ashore alone?" pursued Nicholas, to which the other answered, "Yes, the captain was not very willing to send the cutter to the wharf again." The boy of New England stood pondering a little while his companion waited. "The wind has risen greatly, and the rollers come in very big across the mouth of North Cove. I think you cannot get back without another oar in the boat, nor should even that be risked for 2 hours more. The tide must be at the very ebb just now, and there is a reef not even the smallest boat can cross with the water down and the wind up." He reflected for a little and concluded, "I will go back to the inn, lest my being so long gone should make talk, and the talk reach Mr. Cornelian's ears. When all is quiet, I will come out again to fetch you." And thus they parted until the tide should be right for them all to embark. It was a fortunate thing for all concerned that Joseph Ryle remained to sup with Mr. Darius Cornelian that evening. Everyone knew the reputation Phoebe Harmon had for her bounteous serving of the guests of the Blackbird Inn. The narrow-eyed lawyer watched Dolly, who assisted with the waiting on the table, and afterwards was not averse to boasting, among such men as would suffer him, that he had been served "by a lady to the manor born, who handed me my plate of fried scallops as though she were a duchess in waiting." It is possible that, had Joseph Ryle known just what thoughts of him were going through Dolly Drury's mind as she handed him the pewter plate with its savory contents, even his thin, dried-up person might have shriveled a little under her fierce scorn. But Dolly, when she set out to do any task, threw all her heart into doing it magnificently well. She took certain pleasure tonight in serving these two unwelcome guests with the manner of a princess in disguise. Since Phoebe gave her so much help in the nursing of her uncle, she, in return, offered all the aid she could in carrying on the work of the place. She savored her labors with an oddly flavored combination of capable skill, dignity, and high spirits, that the few guests which the hard times afforded All declared that they would ride across the whole colony for the sake of partaking, at their journey's end, of the pleasant hospitality of the Blackbird Inn. After supper, Mr. Corland and Mr. Ryle fell into a very absorbing game of cards, so that Nicholas, coming down from his uncle's room, saw with relief that they were plainly settled for the whole evening. He was sure that with the bright lights, the warm coziness, and the drawn curtains within, and with the steadily increasing of cold and wind without, there would be no one tempted to walk in the garden of the inn that night. He hurried across the stretch of grass, followed the hedge for safety even in the dark, and heard, as he went, the great breakers beginning to crash in thunder on the long crescent-shaped stretch of beach beyond the marsh. South of the marsh and north of the town, the brief interval of sand changed to rocks again, jutting out first in a short promontory which made the passable shelter of North Cove. Then beyond this little bay, running far out into the bold granite headland which guarded Branscombe Harbour. Just off Branscombe Head was Pelman Island, and behind the island, riding safe in its lee, was, so he felt quite certain, the waiting French ship, invisible even as to her lights, both from beach and harbour. He had scarcely reached the lower window beside the hedge when he heard the two within descending the ladder. "Careful, Etienne," Michael was saying, as though his comrade was still giddy from that wound of which he had made so little. They came together to the opening beneath which Nicholas was waiting. "So you are safely here," said Etienne. "And now it will be but the briefest time before these awkward guests of yours are off your hands, and you can breathe easily once more." Nicholas could speak freely aloud now, for the noise of the wind would drown out almost any sound. Yet he seemed not to be able to frame the words in his heart. "I do not want you to go." Instead, he only managed to stammer rather awkwardly, I hope you have not seemed to be waiting too long. It appeared to me that supper in the inn would never end." "It was not so long," Etienne assured him, "although I observed that after your departure some strange blight seemed to settle upon my young friend here, who is usually a lad of gay and sufficient talk. The good Dobbin, munching in his stall, was almost as lively and loquacious company through these hours as Monsieur Slade. What has been ailing you, Michael? Why have you been so lost in thought that you scarcely answered when I spoke?" "Nothing. I do not know what ailed me," muttered Michael. "Here is the stool upon which, as you told me, the constable sat to rest himself, and which probably broke the lawyer's shins in the dark. Step upon it, and you are safe over the sill." They trudged together down the lane, felt the full sweep of the blast as they came past the end of the hedge, crossed a ridge, and strode down into the hollow of the marsh. The rough roadway circled its edge and led them finally through a barrier of rocks and down to the round sweep of sand and the bit of sheltered beach. Nicholas had heard that it was in this place that guns, smuggled from England, had once been landed to help the colonies in their fight for liberty. It was only a vague rumor, a tale of someone who saw the heavy wagons and the toiling horses go silently by on such a night as this. Not even the town of Branscombe had ever been let into the true secret of their coming. But that winding cart track had been little used, save for just such hazardous and secret purposes. Michael, feeling about for his boat, found it under the lee of a rock, not far from the edge of the water, which had ebbed away and was now coming in again. "It is safe to light the lantern," Nicholas told him. "No one can ever see us from the village or the inn." With little difficulty they got the dinghy down to the water and held her there, bobbing, with the lantern in the stern, so that Etienne Bardot might embark. But just as he stepped forward and laid his hand upon the gunwale, Michael Slade, who had scarcely opened his lips as they walked down to the shore, now spoke suddenly. "Wait," he said. "There is something that you must know. I am not going with you. I will row with you out to the ship, but I am not going to sail in her. Our voyaging together must come to an end." "Why?" Etienne straightened up and spoke in a tone sharp with momentary astonishment, but which softened instantly. "My dear Michael, what idea is this? You say that our seafaring together is done? Why?" "I do not know," Michael answered. It only seemed that things are not the same after the talk we have had concerning our country's need, after those words under the window concerning lives and honor. I have thought it out, sitting in the dark with you, and suddenly I see that I must stay. It has been an adventurous, pleasant life which I have led, voyaging about the world in your company, but I am really of small use to you. I am none to the cause which you serve, and here I feel suddenly that, though it is only a very little I can give, I may be of some use to my own land. I do not understand myself just what has come to me." "I understand it." Etienne spoke very gently. "I have seen a change here, a change there, in you during this past year. You were growing up, my good comrade, a thing which, in spite of your 21 years, you have not done before. It was in a boy's spirit of adventure that you carried arms in the Yorktown campaign. It was for a boy's hasty quarrel that you left your home. It was," here the words were spoken very low, "it was a boy's blind love that you have bestowed upon a friend not so worthy as you have thought him. And now, first by degrees, and then in sudden awakening, you see as a man sees. You know that you must serve those about you rather than follow your own desires." He stepped into the boat and set the lantern down between the thwarts. "On every day that I miss you, I will think of two good friends left behind doing their utmost together to help America stand safe before the world. May I go thus thinking of the two of you, Monsieur Nicholas Drury?" Nicholas nodded. Such purposes, the defense of his country's beliefs, his small share in the upholding of her fortunes and her honor, these were things of which a boy of his sort would never be able to speak. You may think of us so together," was all that he managed to say at last. With this statement Etienne Bardot seemed quite satisfied, for he settled himself in the stern sheets without further words, and motioned to the two that they should push off. It was not difficult for the boys to launch the little boat into the spent rollers that washed into the cove, but as they pulled stoutly into more open water, the wind and the great waves, advancing upon them out of the dark, caught them and flung them first high, then low, as though in tumultuous sport. Their oars seemed to have no part in their toiling progress, for, as they climbed painfully up one steep mountain of water, such rowing as they could do seemed of no possible aid in that precipitous ascent, and as they rushed breathlessly down into the next valley, they seemed to slide headlong, helpless rather than moving of their own effort. The struggle was too great for anyone to have breath or thought for talk, except for Nicholas saying briefly, "It will not be so bad as this for long. We will pull into the lee of the island in a moment." Yet scarcely had they struggled into the slightly quieter water, there fell upon them the greatest danger which had yet threatened. Advancing suddenly out of the dark came a boat under close-reefed sails, a small, heavy-looking sloop, pitching and plunging and bearing straight down upon them. "What a clumsy helmsman she must have," thought Nicholas. "Or is the man asleep?" He raised his voice into a great shout, which the wind instantly carried away. "Port your helm! You will run us down!" The little vessel, like a ghostly apparition, swept by them so close that Etienne in the stern might have touched her side. "That was a close thing," said Michael, "and precious bad seamanship. Great heaven, the fella is coming about!" Around into the wind the sloop was indeed swinging, and now came sweeping upon them on another tack. As she came close they could make out that there were only 2 men aboard her, one short and with shoulders humped and bent before the cutting wind, the other very tall and thin, his ungainly figure plainly silhouetted as he stood up once against the background of the sail. She rose upon a great billow, while the 3 in the small boat were wallowing in the trough below. As her long bowsprit hovered above them, it seemed certain that her bow would come stamping down directly amidships of the dinghy. It was the gigantic strength which dwelt so unexpectedly in the slim figure of Michael Slade which saved the 3 of them. One last ounce of extra effort he threw into a sweep of the oars. Their small craft leaped forward, and once more the sloop slipped away into the dark. "She cannot beat to windward now to threaten us again," said Nicholas. "But who could be abroad on such a night as this, and what purpose could he have in attempting our destruction?" "Some friend of Darius Courland," observed Etienne dryly from the stern. "He has helpers in strange places. That broad man at the helm I have seen before. I believe he flinched at the last second, otherwise he would have had us." They were moving through smoother waters now, although even here it took all the strength of both the rowers to go forward. It seemed very long indeed, that battling journey in the dark, with never a further word spoken until, after the better part of an hour, Etienne's voice observed, "Yonder is the ship." She was not a very great vessel, the Deux Frères, tossing at anchor under the shelter of the island, but she loomed black and ominous above them as they came under her cutwater, looking far upward to see only the glimmer of a lantern here and there upon her deck. A single face peered, ghost-like and curious, over the rail as the dinghy pulled alongside. Nicholas remained, holding the pitching boat as the 2 climbed the ladder, wondering for one wild moment how it would be to sail away in that big dark ship, leaving all the doubts and perplexities, all confusion of duty and responsibility, behind. It would be of no use, he thought, coming to himself with a sigh. No sails would be broad enough, or wind sufficiently swift, to carry him away from all that lay so heavy upon his heart. The unreasonably determined efforts of the little boat to dash herself to pieces against the vessel's timbers finally occupied all his thought and left him no leisure for fantastic dreams. Michael Slade, a few minutes later, came scrambling down the ladder with a stout seaman behind him. "The captain is not going to sail until morning," he explained, "and since it must take a little time to arrange my discharge, I will not leave the ship until then. But Francois and I will put you ashore now." "Then take the tiller," directed Nicholas, "since you will have to row on the way out to the ship again." He could vaguely see Etienne Bardot standing above, with his hand raised in a gesture of farewell as they pulled away. The iron-armed Francois, who had no form of speech apparently, but a broad grin and a few friendly grunts, was an oarsman of such prowess that the little craft fairly flew through the water on the shoreward passage. She grounded easily at last upon the sand of North Cove, and Nicholas laid down his oars and stepped out. "Until tomorrow," Michael said briefly, seeming already to be busy with the task of getting off again. "If you do not find me at the inn, I shall be at the counting-house near the wharf," Nicholas answered as the boat slid into the first big slapping wave and was gone. Michael had not said that to have Nicholas present himself at the inn close upon midnight, accompanied by a total and unexplained red-haired stranger with a southern drawl, might have excited more comment than would be quite comfortable, and that he would therefore appear in Branscombe in a more suitable and ordinary manner. Nicholas had not found it necessary to say that he understood, but he smiled to himself as at the thought that here was a comrade who would stand by him in large or small difficulties with an understanding and a loyal heart. He walked away with swinging stride across the beach, up the Marsh road, and out over the ridge where the wind smote him. He drew great breaths of the wild, clean air, as though the very tumult of the gale was blowing away final difficulties and giving him new strength. He hastened up the narrow lane, squeezed through the hedge, and came once more to the door of the little room which looked upon the garden. The fire within had been replenished, and the candles lighted upon the table, though the books and papers lay undisturbed, just as he had left them. As he came inside the yellow light, there was upon his face an expression which had not been there for many a day past, a look of cheery calm and untroubled determination. All night he had sat over these baffling and discouraging documents, trying with all his might to come to the decision which he knew must be reached. Yet morning had found him with the half-written proclamation put aside and with no real plan achieved. But now, in the haste and excitement of that tumultuous day, his mind had reached a definite resolve. He went straight to the table and took up the paper upon which he had been writing when the grey light of morning had driven away the blackness of night. Let it be known that the work in this shipyard, on the wharves, docks, and ships, is now finally declared closed and finished. In his ears, as he had written, there had seemed to be ringing the town crier's bell, proclaiming the same news in the marketplace for all men to hear, jangling out the knell of 100 hopes. That bell should ring in his ears no longer. He strode across to the hearth and dropped the paper upon the fire, watching it grow brown and wrinkled, and then burst into flame. Some of the words were still legible. Wharves, ships, finally. If America needed ships, then ships, somehow, she must have. The determination was the first thing. The means and methods must follow. Already he was beginning to have an inkling of how a great enterprise might still be undertaken. In his mind's eye, as he stood watching the paper shriveling in the blaze, there grew up a vision, swift, intangible, like the very flame itself. It was a dream of all that he would do for his country, which so needed the help that men could give, a picture of stout hearts standing sturdily for brave beliefs, of busy hands and ringing hammers building up again the lost prosperity, of white-sailed ships faring boldly forth to sea to show all people what Americans could offer in lives and fortunes, in courage and spirit. Never, so long as he lived, could he have put that dream into spoken words. Never could he have repeated that whisper stirring in the very depths of his heart. Our sacred honor. He touched the pocket where lay the letter which Etienne Bardot had given him. He would not use it. He had no wish to strike against Darius Courland or any other enemy with the secret weapon of conspiracy betrayed. No, he would battle by honest means against honest odds. Tomorrow he would send word, by the post-rider, that Ephraim Havergal should make haste to send down his oaken timbers, for a new keel was to be laid forthwith in the shipyards of Branscombe. End of chapter 3.